Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links video. Today I wanted to go over some of the decks that had been buffed with the latest skill rebalancing that happened a few days ago. So the two skills that got buffed were JOINTECH Stampede and Cybernetic Combat Customization, both of which do work for machine decks but two very different machine decks. So JOINTECH Stampede basically locks your deck into playing only Earth attribute machine type monsters, which basically means we're going to be having all of the JOINTECH cards, whereas Cybernetic Combat Customization doesn't lock you into light, but you get a lot of benefits for playing just light monsters, especially considering some of the different monsters they do have in that deck. So first things first, let's go over the changes. So for JOINTECH Stampede, you can now use the part of the effect that lets you add a monster from your graveyard to your hand twice per duel instead of once per duel. So typically the way this skill works is that it lets you get a discount on some of your boss monsters. So every time you discounted summon one, so you summon it for one less tribute, that's sort of like a +1, but the skill would also give you an actual +1. But now we can use that twice, so we can get a +2 over the course of the duel, and then however many monsters we're summoning out, already boss monsters we're getting out for cheap, then we're getting an extra +1. So this skill now adds so much value. It is now such an economically efficient skill that it's really good, and the deck has been seeing success because of it. Now, one thing we do have to mention is that JOINTECH Stegocelos does take a lot of investment to actually use its effect, because for each monster you want to pop, you have to discard a monster from your hand. So it does kind of feed into that, so everything we're saving sort of goes into Stegocelos' effect, but that kind of works with how the deck wants to play anyway. As for Cybernetic Combat Customization, this skill can now be used to add Proto, Cyber Dragon, or Fusion from your deck or graveyard to your hand an infinite number of times. So no longer is it once per duel for each card. This is really good, because the downside this deck always had was that just getting out a fusion monster could be difficult in some situations. Like you could get out like one, but ideally you want to be getting out a fusion monster every single turn, and this deck could really struggle to do that. We even started playing things like the leading actor just to have another way to get those fusion cards back to our hand. So both skills have noticeably been buffed, and my first impression is that JOINTECH Stampede is stronger. I think the deck was already in a good spot, but now it definitely feels a lot better. As for my first impressions of the skill now buffed, I would say this definitely has potential to be a tier 2 deck. JOINTECH Stampede is now a really powerful skill and does feel really strong. The deck is now really good. Cybernetic Combat Customization, I feel like it still needs a little bit more. Unfortunately, although the skill is really good and it's really like elevated this deck to be a lot stronger than it was, the deck can still sometimes feel a bit lackluster. But now we'll go and take a look at some lists that I've been playing with, and I can tell you my thoughts, feelings, and opinions about them in a bit more granular detail. So first up, we have JOINTECH, and this deck has felt really strong. We actually did go on a bit of a tear. We lost one game basically because we misplayed, because it was our first game of the day. We were still warming up. We were still trying to remember how everything worked. We did have lethal, but we didn't execute it, so we did lose that game. We lost one game because our opponent summoned a Cyber End Dragon and we couldn't get over it. And that was obviously quite disappointing. That's one of the weaknesses of this deck, is if your opponent does just have a like 4,000 attack monster, this deck doesn't easily out it. We did actually manage to take out an Igdrago, but that's because we got 2 tail flips with our Steel Soldier Gale Vinery, which can reduce the attack of that monster by 800. So that times 2 was 16, which dropped it to 24, which means we could clear it with one of our 2,500 attack boss monsters. The only other loss we had was our very last game of the day, and that's when we played against a hero player. And we did everything we could, but we didn't quite have enough to stop them from just OTKing us with a Shining Flare Wingman play. But we did beat pretty much everything that's relevant in the meta. We did beat hero players, we did beat Light Galaxy, we did beat Music Princess, and we did beat Seven's Roads. We kind of beat all of the heavy hitters in the meta. This deck does feel really strong. So the main gimmick of the deck is that we're able to use JOINTECH Rex to get rid of our opponent's back row. We're able to use JOINTECH Stegocelos to get rid of their attack position monsters if they have low enough defense, and we can use Shield Boring Kong to get rid of their face down defense position monsters. Now, if our opponent's attack position monsters are too strong, we can use effects like Nail Hedgehog and effects like Gale Vinery to reduce their attack and hopefully be able to attack over them. As long as they're not, like we say, too big, because then we have to rely on Gale Vinery's Tails effect going off more than once in a turn, which is a little bit high roll. But one of the really cool combos we can do with this deck is we can use the skill, reveal one of our specifically Stegocelos or Rex, and then we can basically loop them. So Rex is really good for this. We can, for example, summon out a Rex, then our opponent could, let's say, activate Shiny Shady, flip our Rex down. Then we could summon out Leo, activate Leo, get back a second Rex to our hand, tribute over the first Rex, and then we can just go again. As well as, because of our skill lets us get a card back, we could grab back a Rex, to get a second Rex into rotation, which is just, again, really, really good. One of the things I really like to do with this deck is mill our Shield Boring Kong and then use the skill to get it back into our hand. Now, don't forget as well, we do mill 3 when we use the skill, so that can immediately start digging, but that's why we're playing so many other milling cards to try and get everything online. So now Hedgehog, this does mill a card. We're playing Raptor, which mills 2. We're playing Crusher Drone, which also mills 2, because Crusher Drone, on its own, not the most interesting monster, but milling 2 is really, really advantageous in this deck, because quite often we'll find ourselves with one boss, but you really want to have 2 or 3 bosses to get things rolling, so we want to just turbo mill into the graveyard before we activate the skill to increase the likelihood that we find another boss monster. Stegoselos is still a really, really powerful boss, being able to send up 3 Earth attribute machine type monsters from your hand to the graveyard, destroy face-up monsters with 1600 or less defense on your opponent's field. Now, this effect can be quite relevant. There are some monsters that are kind of annoying. For example, Galactica Oblivion does have 2500 defense, so we can't easily get over that. But Gale Vinery does reduce most other boss monsters by 800 defense, which can put them low enough to pop with Stegoselos. There was a game where our opponent summoned out the Charmy Witch and a 7's Paladin, and we used Gale Vinery to reduce the defense of the Paladin, and then we could use Stegoselos to pop both of the monsters. And that is one matchup this deck actually does feel really good into. This deck feels really, really strong into 7's Road specifically, and it was one of our easiest matchups throughout the day. Curse of the Rising Light is especially good in this deck because, again, we have such easy access to Rex. If we summon out Rex, our opponent is basically forced to respond with some sort of trap card, and if they do, that means that Curse of the Rising Light comes online and we get a free draw too. So anytime you have easy access to a monster that can threaten back row, Curse of the Rising Light is almost an auto-include because it's just so powerful in those situations. And we are playing quite a few traps. I think Trap Hole did come up quite a lot, and it was very useful in some of the matchups we played. So, for example, Trap Holing a 7's Road Witch is really good. Hitting an Extraplorer is really good. Sometimes it can be good to hit a Music Princess boss monster, but obviously it won't work on any of the fusions. But we are still playing the Pot of Greed, which is why we're on this over something like Compulsory. Now, like we did say, the main weakness that we found with this deck was giant attack monsters. So what we could theoretically do is swap out Pot of Greed for something like Hammer Shot, and then swap out Trap Hole for Compulse. Then we could aggressively Compulse to get rid of, for example, a Maximum. If it's something like a Cyber End, we could just Compulse it whenever, and that's completely fine. But as is, this version I would say is better, provided that your opponent doesn't summon out like a 4000 attack guy. If you know your opponent is going to be on a 4000 attack guy, then maybe Hammer Shot and maybe Talismanic Seal Array. Talismanic Seal Array is a weird one because we don't really want to be putting all our monsters back into our deck. We want them in the graveyard to be fuel for JOINTECH Rex. But Hammer Shot could potentially be a direction you could take the deck in. Now, the only other thing that did come up was quite often our 1 copy of Shield Boring Kong would end up on the bottom of our deck. So I would quite like to run 2, but then you run into the issue of, do I have too many spell traps and do I have too many boss monsters? We're already playing 7 bosses in this deck. That doesn't tend to matter because we can get them discounted. Now, Shield Boring Kong can't get a discount. You always have to tribute 2 monsters to summon this. So as long as it isn't like at the very bottom of your deck, as long as you can use the skill, mill it into the graveyard, and then get it back with the skill, you're pretty much good to go. But like I said, in a lot of cases, it was on the bottom of our deck. It did kind of suck. Now, what we could do is go up to 8 bosses. That doesn't feel great. The other thing we could do is like take out a Stegoselos and replace it with Shield Boring Kong, but our skill only works if we reveal a Rex or a Stegoselos, so it kind of lowers the consistency of the deck. So I think I'm quite happy with 1 Kong, even though I just want it to not be on the bottom of my deck quite as much. But after a day of testing, I would say this deck feels really, really strong. I'm really, really happy with how this deck performed. And like I say, I think this deck could be a tier 2 deck going forward. And this is the Cyber Dragon deck that we were playing. This deck felt okay, but still not overwhelmingly strong. We still lost a decent amount on this deck, whereas again, with JOINTECH, we barely lost any games. I would say that Cyber Processor is probably the MVP of the deck at the moment. Being able to cheat this out, being able to send something to the graveyard, bring back a Cyber Dragon, or just send a Cyber Dragon, bring it back, and then just change the name to Cyber Dragon is really, really strong. Now, the biggest issues I had with this deck was occasionally you would have Reactor and Serpent, and they're just not very good together unless you already have setup or you already have some sort of other boss monster to tribute into. So for example, if you open just 2 copies of Reactor and 1 copy of Serpent, you can either just gamble with the hand, which is basically summon out both, activate Serpent, hope that you mill 2 lights and then draw a card, and then hope that you've milled the Reincarnation for Reactor, who then mills more cards, and then we'd hopefully get that draw, which would be decent if it works, but other than that, you just kind of have to set a bunch of cards. So I would be tempted to actually remove the reactors and the reincarnation, replace it with Pot of Greed, but then we'd have to get rid of the compulsory evacuation device. Overall, this deck was actually fine. It's not anything crazy. It's not like really, really strong. And quite often we do have to rely on, once again, Gale Vinery to do a lot of heavy lifting. But the deck is decently strong. We're able to relatively consistently get out a Cyber Twin every single turn. Sometimes we're able to get out multiple, but that does require us to have the Fusion already. So you could play this with more than one copy of Fusion as well. That will allow you to more consistently make double Fusion plays. And in a lot of ways, that could be more of a high roll build. I personally do like just playing the one copy because we have infinite access to it. So it makes the deck feel just a little bit more consistent, maybe a little bit less high roll because we can include other spell traps. I will say as well, Cyber Entry, although we did test it out, was not doing very well for us at all, so I would probably cut this card as well. I do think that Barrage of Steel is very much mandatory in this deck because we have no other way to threaten the opponent's back row, and if we commit to like a Cyber Twin, our opponent shadies it, well, not only do we have our only play now stuck in defense position with 2100 defense, there's nothing we can really do with it at that point, but because it has 2800 attack, our opponent does gain that 1500, which puts us in a really bad spot. So this deck I would say is, again, it's better than it was. The deck feels okay, but realistically, I don't even know if this is going to make it to tier 3. I think this is still going to be like a high rogue deck, which is a shame because I think Cyber Dragon has a lot of potential. It's just not really being realized yet. I think when we get a couple more cards for this deck, it could really elevate this deck to being a really strong contender. Again, right now, this deck is fine. This deck can win games on the ladder. This deck can definitely get you King of Games if that's what you're aiming for. I just don't see this deck winning a tournament anytime soon outside of some sort of gimmicky rule set. But let's find some replays, and I could show I've been talking about